Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Now we will discuss the topic of cerebrum. This is a very important topic, and if you are pursuing neurology or neurosurgery in the future, then this is the main topic for you to think about. So our discussion for cerebrum will be divided into three phases, and these three phases are to discuss the anatomy of cerebral cortex first, then we will discuss the histology of cerebral cortex, and then we will discuss the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. Before discussing the cerebral cortex, we should discuss the human brain first. We are discussing a brief overview of human brain. The human brain has three main parts: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain is further divided into two parts, mainly the telencephalon and the diencephalon. Coming towards the telencephalon has two parts: the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia or basal nuclei. Diencephalon has four main parts: thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and subthalamus. And the limbic system, the emotional controller of our body, is contributed both by telencephalon and diencephalon. Parts from telencephalon and diencephalon are contributing for the formation of the limbic system. Midbrain is itself a unit. The hindbrain has three parts: the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. So brain has cavities, fluid-filled cavities, which make and circulate the CSF. So fluid-filled cavity or the ventricle of the forebrain are the lateral ventricles for telencephalon, the third ventricle for diencephalon. The cavity of midbrain is the cerebral aqueduct, and the cavity of hindbrain is the fourth ventricle. Okay, and now our main topic of discussion will be the cerebral cortex. Okay, let's discuss it now. First, we will do some general consideration which you should know, and many of you must have an idea of it. Now, one, it is situated in the cranial cavity. The cerebral cortex is situated in the cranial cavity. Now, in this diagram, we can see that the whole brain is shown, and we can see the cerebrum is situated in the cranial cavity. The cranial cavity is formed by the bones of the calvaria as well as the neurocranium. So the cranial cavity has two compartments by this tentorium cerebelli, by this fold of dura mater, which is having the dural venous sinus. Superior to it, there will be the supratentorial compartment, and inferior to it will be the infratentorial compartment. So the cerebral cortex or cerebrum is situated in the supratentorial compartment. Okay. The cranial cavity houses the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres. You can see in this image that the cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres, and in between these two hemispheres is a fissure, is the groove, and this groove is called longitudinal fissure. Okay, and the two cerebral hemispheres are united together with the help of a communicating network of white matter, which is known as corpus callosum. Because these two cerebral hemispheres are there in this transverse section of the brain, and in between these two is the corpus callosum, which is connecting these two cerebral hemispheres for integration and for coordination. Okay, and the cerebral hemispheres are separated by the help of falx cerebri, which is present in the longitudinal fissure. Okay, we can see in this image that the whole whole cerebral hemisphere is situated in the cranial cavity, and the longitudinal fissure is between two cerebral hemispheres. So in this longitudinal fissure, there is residing the falx cerebri. What is falx cerebri? It is the fold of dura mater, which is extending it and which is separating the two cerebral hemispheres. And we can also see the corpus callosum here, which is uniting the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay. Next. Now discussing one cerebral hemisphere. One cerebral hemisphere has three borders, three surfaces, 6 lobes, three poles and two main parts, two main components, two main segments, that is the sulci and gyri. Okay. So what are three borders? This is a very rough picture of a very rough outline. What we can say, it is a very rough outline of the cerebral hemispheres, through which we can make a concept of the borders and the surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres. So in this side we will discuss the borders, and on this side we will discuss the surfaces. The borders first. Towards the apex, superiorly there will be the supromedial border because it is closer to the midline. This is the midline. Okay. Towards the base, there will be another border. It is inferiorly and near the midline, so it will be the inferomedial border. Okay. And only one border is left, which is here, which is called the lateral border or inferolateral border. Okay. Coming to the surfaces. Now the surface of the cerebral hemisphere between the supromedial border and the inferomedial border is the medial surface. The surface of cerebral hemisphere between the supromedial border and the lateral border is the supralateral surface. And the surface of cerebral hemisphere between the inferomedial and inferolateral border is the inferior surface. Okay? So it has three borders and three surfaces. We can have a more anatomic look in this image. That is, here is the supromedial border, here is the lateral border, and here is the inferomedial border. Okay? And then here will be the medial surface between the supromedial and inferomedial borders. Here will be the supralateral surface between the supromedial and inferolateral or the lateral borders. And here will be the inferior surface between the inferomedial and inferolateral border. Okay? So now we can have a nice concept that the cerebral hemisphere has three borders and three surfaces. Now the lobes. Lobes basically are 5, but some people consider 6 lobes of cerebral hemisphere as well. So there are the frontal lobe corresponding the frontal bone, the parietal lobe corresponding the parietal bone, the occipital lobe corresponding the occipital bone, and the temporal lobe corresponding with the temporal bone. There is another hidden lobe inside the cerebral hemisphere, which is called the insula or the island. Okay. And if we look on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, some parts of different lobes, some part of parietal, frontal, and a temporal lobe coalesce to form another independent structure, which is called the limbic lobe. Okay? Actually, the limbic lobe is made up of the parts which are actually the parts of other lobes. Okay? But they have similar functions. So some people consider, some neuroanatomists consider it as a separate lobe, which is the limbic lobe. Okay? Poles. Cerebral hemisphere has 3 main poles. Poles क्या होती हैं? Extremes of a segment, extremes of a part. So there are 3 poles in each cerebral hemisphere. There is a frontal pole, there is a temporal pole, there is an occipital pole. Occipital pole is the pole of the occipital lobe. Temporal pole is a broadly convex pole of the temporal lobe, and the frontal pole is the pole of the frontal lobe. ठीक है? Parietal की pole नहीं होती because parietal lobe has no communication with the extreme. ठीक है? It been between the temporal, occipital, and the frontal lobes. Okay. Now a very important concept, the sulci and gyri. Because cerebral cortex is the highest center of the brain and it has to control our body. So it is enclosed in the cranial cavity and it cannot expand itself. So to increase the surface area for efficient working, and by the virtue of the theory of evolution, the cerebral cortex has indented itself, has made sulci or fissures inside. वो grooves बना लेगा अपने अंदर ही ताकि surface area बढ़ जाए. So the grooves which are formed are called the sulci. ठीक है? And the area of cortex in between the grooves which has become elevated and which has increased the surface area is called gyri. ठीक है? Singular gyrus होगा, plural में gyri हो जाएगा. Okay? So these were the main consideration of the cerebral cortex. Lobes की डिटेल हम अगली वीडियो में डिस्कस करते हैं.